Family, welcome back to another episode. Start out with a shout out to all my audience. Thanks for subscribing. Met a great milestone. I got my first 100 subscribers. Doesn't sound like a lot. Definitely want to get a lot more than that, but it definitely was a big milestone. So thank you for your support. Thank you for stopping by to check out what I have to offer, what I have to discuss. And welcome to anyone watching, Chiefs, Chief Petty Officers, Chiefs in Training, or anyone else willing to take time to sharpen your leadership cutlass. I'm Paul Kingsbury. I'm a retired Fleet Master Chief and author of the Chief Petty Officers Guide, 2nd edition. And like I said, thank you for joining me. If you're a first-time viewer, make sure you hit down there and hit that subscribe button and go back and check out some of those other videos. And as I mentioned, we just crossed the 100 threshold. So when I get to 200, I will be giving away a signed copy of the Chief Petty Officers Guide to one of those subscribers. So you'll make sure you want to subscribe and share this content. Also, leave me comments, right? I'll take it all. So if you like what you like, give me a like button and then give me comments, right? Share your experiences. What do you have to offer on the topic? What experiences do you have on the topic? But I'll also take a thumbs down too, but give me constructive feedback with it so I can improve and make better content, okay? So I'm pretty thick-skinned, but keep it professional and give me some good feedback, all right? And then also other resources I've got out there. You might want to check out the Cutlass Podcast and the Cutlass Leadership blog. You can check that out at my website at www.cutlassleadership.com. Whole bunch of resources there, including access to these videos and my podcast channel where I discuss a lot of this content. So, and then you can also get information on how you can get your signed copy of the Chief Petty Officer's Guide. So, all right, you ready? Let's get into the next topic. So before we begin with today's topic, I want to review the 5 kind of points of my framework that I've built this content around, whether it's a video, it's the podcast, the blog pieces I write. And this is based on my personal experience, things I've come to learn, things I've read about, and based on things I've seen, it kind of all has come together, and I find it very insightful and useful. So number 1, know and develop 8 power bases. Number 2, know and gain proficiency in using 9 influence tactics. Number 3, develop a strong suite of communication skills. And that's written, that's verbal communication skills, that's personal presence, that's online, all that kind of tools of communication that you can use. Number 4, learn about and use and apply situational leadership theory to help you best select the influence tactics best suited for the situation and the leadership style for the situation that best calls. And then number 5, solicit feedback from the people you work for, your peers, and the people that work for you to make sure that you get a sense of how effective your influence tactics and your leadership style and management approaches are being, okay? So those are the 5. Today we're going to jump into another one of your power bases. To date, I've covered several. So we've talked about position power. We talked about your expert power, your personal power, and how they develop your credibility and your competence, and basically how that relates to trust, and how your teams will start to develop buy-in you and move you beyond just being a positional leader. We've talked about information power base. We talked about reward power, using things like praise and organizational tools of reward like medals or letters of recommendation, things like that. So today we're going to go the other side of that, and we're going to get into the what I would call the stick or the hammer side of leadership, and that's your coercive power base. And today we're going to dive into 10 tools that you've got in that coercive power-based toolbox. Now I know it sounds bad already, right? Coercive power, and we always like to lead in a positive way, but this is a tool that you're going to have to learn to use as a leader, okay? So when you use coercive power, there's going to be a time when you use it. You're not going to step off using this kind of stuff, but you are going to have people in situations where they're not going to respond to your other influence tactics and your other approaches. Maybe their attitude's gone off. Maybe they just don't give a damn, frankly. And you try to, you've used performance coaching, you've used performance feedback, you've tried mentoring, you've tried all these kind of more positive, softer approaches, and they're not working. So then you are going to have to shift to using influence tactics that are based with coercive power. And we'll talk about that a bit, okay? Because ultimately what you want to do is you want to compel this person, you want to be able to gain compliance, and you want to get the behavior and the outcomes that you want, whether it's an attitude or whether it's work performance or what have you. So some people aren't comfortable using this, and that's another reason I think it's important to talk about it. If reward power is the ability to shape and empower influence tactics that are based on giving people things they want and recognizing and praising them, then coercive power could be considered your ability to influence people with tools where you threaten to impose costs or threaten to remove things that they want. So that's what it's about. And it can vary in form, right? It can be something as simple as a facial gesture and how you look at someone, right? And we use this a lot with our kids, right? Sometimes all it takes is a glance when they're doing a bad behavior and a look in their direction, and then they stop that behavior because they know that look implies there's a follow-on cost that could come if they don't change the behavior. And then it can range all the way up, right? Like we're going to talk about. You can use things like performance counseling and other tools of influence that you've got in a leadership or management position to influence behavior or withdraw privileges or, impact career progression and things, and ultimately terminate employment, all the way up to the high end of stuff you're going to see, right? If you're a fan of YouTube, or not YouTube, but Netflix, and you're watching Narcos or you're watching one of these murder shows, right? There's people that will threaten, bribe, and coerce with the threat of death or, just some heavy-handed stuff. We're definitely not getting into that. That's not the realm we operate in. There are people that do it, and you can go back and watch videos of how dictators and lots of leaders have been successful using these kind of heavily based, coercive, power-based influence approaches, right? But we'll get into that perhaps in a chapter down the road, because I think there's some learning from those leadership styles as well as unpopular. The outcomes, right? The aims are normally not noble, and they're not definitely things we're after. But these leaders that use those coercive power tools are successful in their own goals and objectives and getting large bodies of people to do what they want or need them to do. So again, this is not a fun area of leadership, but you've got to learn to do it, because I'm telling you, it can be very time dependent when these situations arise. And many times when you're going to have to give kind of more professional feedback with coercive power tools and threaten to impose cost or impact a career or something like that, you're probably going to have observed those behavior over a matter of time. You're going to have time to have sat down with the person, planned out your delivery. Maybe there's formal counseling sheets that you use that kind of guide those discussions. But in some cases, you're going to be just out there in these situations, and someone's going to, spout out to you, or they're going to resist what you want them to do, or they're not going to take an order from you. And sometimes that's in a crisis situation. Sometimes it's in front of other people. So an important thing about coercive power is if you're going to threaten with one of these tools that you've got in your coercive power, you got to be willing to do it. And if you find yourself unwilling or unsure about the tools and the limitations of these coercive power tools, and some of them are legally bound or constrained on what you can do, if you start misapplying this and you can't deliver with it, other people are going to see that, and your own leadership influence and your personal power base are going to take a hit. And the next time you try to do this, your credibility is not going to be as pronounced. So it's been my experience, and I've seen lots of situations where people try to step off and threaten, and they don't fully know the tools, or they use the wrong tool for the situation. So we're going to get... All right, so here are 10 things that you can use in your coercive power base. And we're going to go. So number one, expressing disappointment or withdrawing your approval. Okay, and this is something, again, that, knowing your people before you use these is very important, right? And in many cases, this is just, hey, I'd be so disappointed if you did this, or if you did this thing, I would be unwilling to or unable to support you in whatever endeavors you're doing, okay? And you see these kind of things thrown around. Parents use this a lot. You've probably seen it used maybe in politics and other areas, but that is one aspect that you can use, is this, withdrawing of, showing disappointment in people and withdrawing.
All right, let's get into number two. Let's talk a little bit about a thing called fear of the unknown. And this is one that I've seen parents use. I've used a little bit in my professional career, but it's more of an indirect approach. And it's not a direct threat by you, but it allows the person to kind of develop in an indirect way their own assessment of the threat or the risk based on the outcome. And it's basically, you see something perhaps in the middle of the day or early in the day, something happens, and instead of handling it right then or engaging with a coercive power tool or a threat of something to happen, maybe you express some disappointment, and then you come in on top of that and you talk about, all right, I want you to come see me at the end of the day and we'll discuss what's going to happen. So you give them time to simmer on it, and in many cases, well, depending on the person, you'll see that they'll have the opportunity to sit there, think about their actions, and perhaps they'll find time before you even plan to meet them, and they've already come up and developed a remediation plan. So based on that fear of the unknown, the things that you could do, some people will internalize that, and they'll react to that, and they'll correct the behavior as they need to, okay? All right, a third thing is, and again, as we go through, remember, your tools are things that you can use to threaten, right? But you can actually use them eventually too when you get into punishment or negative discipline. So you've got to be ready to use these things. So I'm going to package a lot of these as the potential to do the following things. So another tool you've got is directive performance counseling. Okay, and this is going to be later on in the process. So I don't know if I've talked about it on a video. I've talked about it on several of the Cutlass podcast episodes I've talked about. We always start with forms of positive discipline first. And these are things like education, counseling, training, coaching, positive performance feedback, that day-to-day engagement to get people to do the things you want them to do or to develop competence or a positive attitude. But when you go through all those things, you've done training, you've done education, you've coached, you've tried to use all these forms of positive discipline, and for some reason they're not responding or their attitude is off, then you're going to start to shift to more negative discipline or more directive counseling. And this is where you're going to put the threats of outcomes or consequences on paper, right? So it becomes a lot more formalized, it's less verbal, and it should get their attention with that. So you're going to go through the typical performance counseling outline, but at the end of it, you're going to include if you don't do these things, here's the things I will now have to do as a leader to hold you accountable if you can't achieve the standards or the objectives that we want you to. So many times the word counseling gets a negative connotation because I think we always are focused on this negative kind of formalized counseling, but counseling can be positive too, right? It can be a form of positive discipline, and it can be less informal if you need to. So that is a tool you've got, the ability to go to directive performance counseling that you can then eventually cite in evaluations or other forms of discipline that you need to use. Okay. Number 4, so let's get into loss or access to privileges and perks. So in some cases, this is the potential if you get removed from a position of authority or whatever. So if you don't do the things you need to do, if you don't change certain things, you will be removed from this position. And because you're removed from that position, you will lose things that go with it. I've talked about this in the video I did with Raymond Kemp about perks that come with the position. And those aren't perks for you. Those are things to help you do the job, to make your responsibilities a little bit more easier. But you could lose those things that go with it, or you could lose those things altogether. The office, the company car, certain access to benefits and bonuses or club facilities and things like that. So that's one aspect of loss of privileges. On the military side, many of you are familiar, we can give certain privileges. Back in the day, it used to be like civilian clothing was a big deal. That's less so now these days. But, I had to earn my civilian clothing privileges early on in my career, but they could be removed once I had them. If I failed to wear my military uniform in an appropriate way, or if I had, issues with my military appearance or my, military bearing or demeanor, they would use the removal or the threat of removing my civilian privileges as a coercive power tool. So you've got that. And they could do things with driving privileges, access to certain things, and those things are out there still. The point about loss of privileges is you have to be the person who has the authority to give the privileges to take them away. So if someone else higher in the chain of command or higher in the organization has the ability to give those privileges, then you usually don't have the influence to take those away. So you need to be very careful if you're going to threaten taking those away. What you can threaten to do is talk to the person who can take those privileges away, and have those things done. And again, you see this a lot of times in parenting, right? So access to a phone is a privilege, access to certain things, being able to stay up later as a child or whatever. Parents have the ability to shape those and remove those privileges as they need to. So you have the ability to threaten to remove those privileges as a coercive power tool. Okay. All right. Then we can get into formal evaluations or comments in it or downgraded marks in your evaluations. Or at least, again, the prospect of that happening when you're in the threatening phase. But again, if you're going to talk about that, if you're going to lay down a standard and draw a red line on behavior and consequence, you better be willing to do it. So again, those of you in the military are should be familiar with this. It's been my experience, though, that with evaluations, we spend a lot of time figuring out how to write them in the person's best interest and get them advanced and set them up and talk about them in favorable terms. But you've got to be able to use an evaluation kind of in a negative way too, to document performance that isn't so good. And I've had to do this on active duty, even as a command master chief with a chief petty officer, and put some pretty severe remarks that basically I ensured, and my commanding officer who signed that eval ensured that they wouldn't get promoted, or that their prospects of promotion and retention were pretty low. So you've always got the ability to do that. Again, you got to reference those human resource manuals or the advancement manual for your specific service, and those will govern all the ways that the requirements to just downgrade marks on an eval, or the way you can put comments in there, because there's boundaries on what you need to do, and there's processes to do that. So make sure you're informed on those things if you're going to do that. And then we can go to more formal, like talked about a little bit earlier, performance counseling. You can get to more formal methods of that. So you can get to things like letters of caution. You can get to things like letters of caution or letters of reprimand, letters of instruction. These are more formal things that carry more specific direction. So it fully identifies, and they're usually signed by someone higher up in the chain of command, like the commanding officer at this point. So again, it's an escalation at this point of the threats and the pressure that can come for lack of performance, and the impacts it can have on your professional career. So these are very outlined. You failed to do this, because of that the consequences are this. Here's what you need to do to correct that performance, and if you don't do the following things within a set timeline, here's the things that'll happen. You'll either be removed, right? One of these other things that we've talked about. You can lose your qualifications, you can lose your position, you'll get an eval, you'll get a special eval, whatever it is. You do that with this much more formal letters that you've got available. But again, those things are out there. Read about those, learn about how to use them. Check out, there's lots of examples that your supervisors, I guarantee, have of instances they've gotten. Look for those, right? Look for drafts and get a sense of how to write those and learn how to write those things. None of this is, no one likes to do this kind of stuff, but you got to be able to do it, and no one gets any pleasure out of doing it. Well, I'm sure there's people that do get pleasure and they get their own issues, but for most people, when you get into these kind of coercive power tools, there's not a good feeling that you have to do them, but you have to be able to do them, okay? All right, then another thing you've got is the potential withdrawal of qualifications, certifications, security clearances, and things like that. So again, a lot of those things are based on demonstrated competence, right? You've certified and you've qualified to standards, but they also have a tie to your personal character as well. So if you find that you're slipping in these areas, your supervisors or you as a supervisor seeing other people slipping in certain areas of professional or personal behavior, you can threaten that, hey, if you continue this on, I'm going to have to disqualify you. You may lose your certification. In professional fields, lawyers can be disbarred, doctors can lose their licenses. There's some pretty severe consequences that can happen. So again, a lot of these have impacts or potential impacts to a person's career and their upward mobility within an organization. So again, you've got to be willing, if they don't meet standards of competence and character, to either disqualify, decertify, or remove the security clearance as you need to. So that's another tool. Again, reference the manuals that you need to back you up, and make sure you have chain of command support before you go and initiate those actions. All right, and then if we've documented, eventually you can start to impact promotion, right? I can either not recommend you for promotion on evaluations, or I can withdraw your recommendation for advancement. And if you're in the military, you go to the advancement manual. There's very specific procedures on how you have to do that and the criteria. And again, your commanding officer has the authority to make that. But on the civilian side, you make maybe informal recommendations. And this might be kind of, you've been advocating for someone over time, you've been a mentor, and then you've done the advocacy and you're out there trying to set them up for a future opportunity, and you've been speaking on their behalf and vouching for them basically. You can threaten to remove that as well. So it doesn't necessarily need to be formal, but you've got the ability to remove support, like I talked about back in point 1. And this would be a more severe support, where you remove the support for their advancement higher in the organization, or for a job of more responsibility and authority. Number 9, so potential reassignment. So I can either demote you, or I can reassign you to a position of less responsibility if you don't perform in that position. Again, we don't just start out with these kind of tools of influence, right? We start out with, ideally, you start looking at yourself first. If someone's not performing to the standards you want, you reflect and go, okay, have I done what I need to do as a leader or a manager? Have I given them training and education? Have I worked through the situational leadership model, right? So did I delegate to them too early? Did I give them more responsibility and decision-making power than they really had, that they were mature enough to handle from a competence and character standpoint? Maybe it started with you over delegating or misdelegating to someone, or you didn't give them the tools to succeed. So once you've satisfied all that they've done that, and then you've engaged with coaching or supporting as they've moved along, you've engaged with positive performance counseling, and then ultimately you don't see the behavior change that you want, or there's an attitude that's gone sour and that you just can't seem to fix for some reason. This is where you can really recommend to pull them out of that position of responsibility, authority. Perhaps you've delegated too much. You'll have to undelegate, perhaps pass those responsibilities on to someone else. Or in the military circumstances, if I've got your orders to go somewhere or assignment, in many cases, there's duty that you can do that you have to qualify for, and you have to maintain some standards to do that. So I can delay that reassignment, or I can take those orders away from you. Again, read things like the military personnel manual on the Navy side, or whatever your specific service manual is. There's human resource policies on that, but that is a thing that you can do as a leader or a manager. And then finally, at the worst case, you're getting into we've worked through all these things, even all these tools of coercive power that you've got. You've worked through them all. You've done an escalatory kind of approach. You've started with verbal counseling, or you've went to written, or you've tried some of these other things, fear of disappointment, the threat of removal of privileges, and the behaviors or the attitude just doesn't change. Then you're going to get into, hey, we're probably going to cut you loose at that point. So in the civilian world, you can terminate a person. In the Navy, it takes a little more, right? Your commanding officer, normally a sailor's going to go to non-judicial punishment, perhaps courts-martial, depending on the egregiousness of the offense. If you start getting into, breaking laws and criminal activity, you're going to bring in courts-martial then. And then ultimately, you can get a person recommended for a separation. If you're going to administratively separate them, that's going to have to go before an admin board. And again, this is the time. If you're a first, second class petty officer or higher, do you know what the admin separation process is? What it entails? What that involves? You should know that. In many cases, again, your commanding officer is going to make that recommendation or going to make that decision, but you're going to make the recommendation. So you need to understand what the long-term effect is, what the process is, because not only are you recommending that, you still should be advocating for the person and guiding them through that process and helping them understand the thing that you just got recommended for, what the potential outcomes are, and what they can do and what their resources are to prepare for that. So those are the 10 things that you can do. Those tools are there. There's other things you can do as well, but those are the 10 that I think if you've got those tools developed in your tool bag, you're going to find that you've got the ability to use a pressure tactic pretty well. And again, you can use these coercive power tools in many ways, right? I can use it as an inspirational appeal. Like, I know you can do so much better than this. I don't want to get in a position to have to do whatever these things we just talked about. Or rational persuasion. Hey, sit down with me. I want to talk to you about kind of here's where your behavior leads to, right? Do you understand the outcome, right? And you just talk to people in a very straight up way and explain with facts and figures what can happen, and you're trying to use these softer, I would call, less, pressure-based influence tactics to get them to change their mind. Perhaps you use a coalition tactic, right? You sit down with someone who's been there and done that and then went through it and go, hey, sit down with me and Joe over here, and let's talk you through this. Or, hey, Mary had this experience, she went through this. Let her explain how she decided not to do that. So you can use your connection power and leverage the experiences of others to try to influence people. So again, these tools are tied to your positional authority. So you've got limitations on what you can do. So again, you got to sit down and really take inventory of like, hey, if I had to use pressure today or threaten something today, what are those things that I have the ability to do? But then you need to understand what your boss has the ability to do, because you're going to be in the position to make recommendations higher up the chain of command to do that. So in the military, for example, a commanding officer, again, we can ultimately, if our personal influence tools aren't working, we can now reference that to non-judicial punishment and let people with more coercive power in the chain of command do things that we necessarily can't. So they can, if I now take you non-judicial punishment or courts-martial, right? Let's just start with NJP. Now the CO can reduce you in rate. They can restrict you to the ship. They can fine you, right? Those are things that your average person can't do in the military, but they can. And these are getting into pretty severe things. When you start taking people's pay away, you really start to impact their personal life. And it's not to say they didn't deserve it, but these costs that you're imposing now have an impact not just on the person, but on a person's family and frankly on where they are in Maslow's hierarchy, right? You might even drive them down. So you've got to really understand when you're making these recommendations what potential impacts they can have on the people that are receiving them. And then, of course, your commanding officer can refer stuff if it's severe criminal activity up to courts martial, and now you're getting into some pretty severe stuff that can ultimately lead to jail time and some pretty egregious fines and things like that. So take time, make sure you know that. I'll list some of the resources here in a little bit about what you can do. So you do have significant impact on these outcomes. You have your recommendations usually carry significant weight, but I'm going to tell you this, my experience has been, especially in the military, if you're going to go to your boss or a higher boss and recommend one of these more coercive forms, if you're going to recommend taking someone's pay away or fining them or restricting them to the ship, or in the civilian sector, if you're going to recommend have someone fired, you better have your ducks in a row. You better show that boss that, hey, I've done everything that I've got. I've used all my tools of influence that are available to me. Here's when I did them. Here's how I used them. Right? This is why we require this kind of administrative trail to show that you've used all these tools. Because again, when you start getting into using these tools that ultimately lead to punishment and life-altering consequences in many cases, people don't take those decisions lightly, and the people making those decisions want to know that the people closest to the problem have done everything within their power to handle that situation. So take inventory of it. If you find yourself in non-judicial punishment with representing one of your sailors as the chain of command, the CO looks over you and goes, "What have you done?" And you start, you own that, right? So that's why your commanding officer is going to ask and challenge you and your departmental leadership on those kind of things. Okay, so again, a great place to start by knowing the governing documents that cover all these tools of coercive power. Like I said, you got organizational human resource manuals on the military side, and again, my experience is obviously Navy, but we have the military personnel's manual, you have the advancement manual, you have your Uniform Code of Military Justice, you got the manual for of the Judge Advocate General, and you got the manual for courts martial. Those all get into all those processes that govern coercive power, and you got to know those. Okay, scan through. You don't have to read them all in depth either. Just scan through the table of contents and find an area you're not familiar with. And a good way to think about this is, if I had to tomorrow recommend to take someone's advancement away, would I know the rules and the boundaries and who would do that? And if you don't know what that is, go in and look that specifically up, right? If one of your people got frocked and you wanted to withdraw their frocking recommendation or delay their frocking, if you wanted to make that recommendation, would you understand how it works, who has to make that decision, and what the criteria are? Okay, those are things you need to do. If you wanted to remove a certain privilege, would you understand whose authority is it to do that, right? Can you do that? Can you not, right? Again, you don't want to go in using and threatening coercive power tools with people and then you can't back them up, because I'm telling you, your credibility is going to take a hit. Other people are going to see that, and you're just going to start to look ridiculous. And frankly, your personal power is going to take a hit as well, and then your people and your teams are going to start to lose trust in your ability to use coercive power and pressure tactics. It's not that they don't think you can't or won't use them, but they want to make sure you're going to use them in a consistent and fair way as well. Okay, so that all speaks to your personal power. So I'll probably get more into things like negative discipline and kind of specific outcomes or specific situations in a later episode. But I think for now, I've offered you a lot on coercive power and the tools. Hopefully I've given you something to think about. I want you to take inventory of those things. Think about them. Like I said, if you just question all the things that you've seen done to you, or that you may feel the urge that you want to do, the first things you have to go back and, number one, have I done everything I need to do as a leader or a supervisor to have fulfilled and set that person up for success doing the things they need to do? The training, the education, the positive discipline, the coaching, the performance counseling, working through the situational leadership model, right? Properly delegating. If you feel good about that and you've worked through those things, then you can go through in a very progressive way these tools of coercive discipline. And you can see on the video, I've listed each one down. Now, I've tried to scale them from least impactful to worst, and work through each one of the 10 that we've talked about, and then just go, hey, how familiar am I with that kind of specific coercive power tool? And as you work through and write those things down, I think you're going to learn a lot. You're going to go in those manuals. You're going to figure out how to, for example, adjust. How do you make negative? When and how do you downgrade a person in evaluation, or how do you write those negative comments in a professional way in an evaluation? So, okay, again, I hope you found this episode useful. There's several other resources you've got. So in the Chief Petty Officer's Guide, Chapter 2 and Chapter 6 cover it. So Chapter 2 is the fundamentals of power and influence. It talks very briefly about the power and influence model. And then Chapter 6 is called Carrots and Sticks. So I talk in there about using reward power and the reward power tools. And again, people respond much more favorably to tools of praise and reward power than they do the threats. But there are that resistant group that you're going to have to be able to use threats and those sticks with. So check out Chapter 6 of the Chief Petty Officer's Guide. And then also Cutlass Podcast episode number 19 that was titled How to Use Punishment When You Need to. Again, I had a guest on. We talked through this whole chapter as well. So you've got great resources. If you read the Chief's Guide, this video, listen to the podcast, I think that's about all you can, that I can offer you at this point. And then, from time to time, I'll probably recircle around on this topic. I'll weave it into other situations. I might blog about and other things. So again, I think I've given you some stuff to reflect on. So take what you learned, reflect on it, grow, and then go out and make a positive difference in the personal, professional life of the people around you. And I'll see you in the next video.